Hi, everyone. We are here for the month's Ask Us Anything. So this is an opportunity for athletes to submit their questions and answer anything that you have an interest in regards to nutrition, performance nutrition, and anything that's sort of associated with that. So we have Elizabeth, myself, and Alan joining us today, and we'll get through as many questions as we can, and if there's any extra questions at the end, we will go through those.
So I have a question if no one else does.
Oh, well, we're going to answer the live we'll answer the questions first, and then we'll go into live questions afterwards.
Gotcha.
If that's all right, Manny. Cool.
Okay.
Okay. So first question is from Mike, and unfortunately Mike didn't submit his last name, but he asked, how come my daily calories are not adjusted based on activities like they are in MyFitnessPal? Well, Mike, the first point being is MyFitnessPal is simply a calorie tracker, so it doesn't know what you're going to be doing until after you've done it. Whereas with our program, what we're factoring in is the amount of exercise that you are planning on doing for the week, along with the purpose in terms of, are you looking to lose weight or are you in a high performance state? And as such, we account for the daily calories that you would require outside of that training. And then any calories that you require for training would be appropriately prescribed to you. So we sort of do what MyFitnessPal is doing in retrospect. We do that prospectively. A new feature that is coming out will be that after a session is completed, your session will automatically update based on Garmin, and you will have a renewed program which would be adjusted based on the exercise that you have done. Currently, you can do that. Currently, you can actually push that if you want. You can request a manual rerun after your session is done, and we will adjust the program appropriately. So that's it. We'll go to the next question. How should one adapt the nutrition strategy on race day if it gets too hot and the core temperature rises? Alan?
Yeah, good question. I think there's two parts to this. One is, I guess, anticipating what the conditions are going to be before the race and factoring that into your nutrition plan. And part of that is adjusting on the fly if things turn out to be dramatically different to what you had originally expected. I guess in that first instance, we talked about this in the session around sort of hydration last week, is kind of understanding what your likely sweat rate is going to be in terms of the minimum likely sweat rate and the maximum likely sweat rate at race pace on the sort of conditions that you might expect on the day, knowing that particularly in a long race like an Ironman, that will change across the course of the day. It's not constant from start to finish as well. So if you have some aspect or some idea of what that minimum expected sweat rate is, I guess you can use that as sort of the minimum volume of fluid that you know you'll probably be able to consistently consume throughout the race, and using that to plan your carbohydrate. I won't go into detail about that. You can go back and look at the recording from last week's session if you want more information about that. And then on the upper end, you know how much fluid you probably, at worst case scenario, you need to have access to or have available to you at any given time. So they're probably the biggest things from a hydration perspective. And I guess that's the thing that really changes a lot with the race. I guess the other things that might change in a hot environment beyond simply your fluid needs might be things like taste preferences. You might find that the sweet foods, you get what we call flavor fatigue. You get over those foods a lot quicker in a race, just the stickiness, the sweetness. Drinks that are in bottles that are sitting in the sun for hours at a time warm up, and then they're much less palatable. So there are some considerations as well. You might go to a sort of a weaker drink mix potentially, as long as you can afford to drink that amount of fluid. So they're possibilities. So you might dilute your drinks a little bit more and then drink a larger volume of them. So you're getting the same amount of carbs, just more fluid for that same amount of carbs. Might be another strategy. In terms of core temperature, from a nutrition point of view, there's not a lot that you can do from that perspective, apart from the temperature of the things that you're consuming. Even that doesn't have a massive impact. It's probably more those other external cooling strategies, things like ice and those sorts of things, which, outside of professional cycling, for example, where you're handed things through the window of a car, is actually extremely hard to access mid-race. So I think the main things would be thinking about that hydration strategy and also heat acclimation, being prepared for a hot environment if it's possible. It's going to be pretty rare, I would have thought, that conditions are going to be a lot hotter than you could have possibly expected and then have to get a big surprise on race day. But I guess it's then going back and looking historically at what the temperature looks like at that race venue over time. Is what are the worst possible conditions or the best possible conditions, and trying to come up with a strategy beforehand. Prevention is going to be much better than cure in this case.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of the core temperature, you mentioned what about like whole body wettedness and things like that? Are they viable strategies, Alan? And
Yeah,
just
so
explain that
particularly,
maybe.
yeah, so depends a little bit on the humidity. So in a dry environment where the humidity is relatively low, then yes, pouring water on your skin can help. So basically the evaporation of fluid off your skin surface will cool you down. And it doesn't matter whether that fluid comes from inside your body, i.e. sweat that you've produced that you're then losing from the body, or it's water that you've applied externally from a water bottle or a hose or something. So regardless, if it evaporates, it'll give you the same cooling effect. And even the temperature of that water doesn't matter from an evaporation point of view. So if it's air temperature water or cool water, the cool water will feel nicer, but it actually doesn't change the ability of it to remove heat from your body. So that's a good point. In those dry conditions, yeah, keeping your skin wet as much as you can. And if you can do that externally, then that's water that you don't have to produce as sweat, and you will actually sweat a little bit less as a result of that. Humid environments much more difficult to do because sweat evaporates much less efficiently in humid weather. And so basically any water, whether it's sweat or externally applied water that's on your skin that drips off your body and doesn't get evaporated, actually does nothing to cool you down. So in a humid environment, you see that a lot. Sweat beads up, it doesn't evaporate, and then it just drips off your body, and it's much less efficient at cooling you down. Unfortunately, there's not a lot you can do about that apart from trying to externally cool with ice and things like that.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay. Elizabeth, next question. Do you suggest mixing MCT and carbohydrate gels for long workout sessions? How many grams of each, 1 per hour? I use it for a triathlon to increase the fat burning mode, but not affect the sport of performance. Elizabeth, and this is from Valentina.
So I'm going to start off with saying we don't suggest mixing MCT and carbohydrate gel. If that's something that you're looking to do at the end of the day in a 2-hour plus ride, great. The added fat is adding calories to the total amount consumed during that training session. So there potentially is a benefit there. But more importantly, what I want to touch on, Valentina says, I use it to increase fat burning mode. That's not going to happen. Clear and simple. You're consuming carbohydrates with that fat. So the idea of utilizing that to increase fat burning, it doesn't work that way. If again, consuming, the potential problem could be with adding too much fat that might slow down some of that absorption. You might end up with GI issues. So we're not saying don't do it, but specifically for the point of fat burning, that's not an effective means. And you would probably better off in terms of focusing on performance and getting the carbohydrates in, and then looking at fat loss somewhere else in your training and daily diet.
I guess just explain what MCT is as well.
Medium chain triglyceride fats, which has a slower absorption than carbohydrates, but a faster absorption than some other kinds of fats, and is often used in the, I guess, wellness space. It had a big moment maybe 10 years ago as an alternative fuel source for people looking to biohack fat burning, coffee, beverage consumption, intermittent fasting, things like that.
Yeah, certainly used a lot by ketogenic
Yes.
crowds as well, to increase calories. I think one of the aspects of this, and again, Alan, I don't know if you've got any takes on this, but certainly for some of those lower intensity, of significant duration where we are recommending taking in some fat and some carbohydrates to provide sort of mixed fuel for those lower intensities, I guess an MCT oil could be consumed. It might just make you feel pretty sick. If it doesn't make you feel sick, then fine. I'd probably be taking in my fat as a whole food source, probably in the form of some nuts or something delicious like that. Alan, have you had any experience using MCT oils directly with carbohydrates?
Not directly, but I guess just sort of re-emphasizing what Elizabeth talked about, that sort of fat burning. Also, I think what we need to think about is, what are we trying to achieve? Are we trying to increase the amount of fat that we've burnt in the session, or are we trying to increase the ability to use fat over weeks and weeks of training? And they're two completely different things.
Yeah.
And to improve the ability to use fat in training from your own body fat stores over a period of time, MCT oil is not going to help you with that. It's all about basically, when you finish a training session, how much carbohydrate, glycogen is left stored in your muscles at the end of the session. And so the idea, if you want to increase your ability to use fat, is to finish sessions with about less than a third of a tank full of carbohydrate, essentially. And so obviously, depending on how big that session is, sometimes you can still feel well for carbohydrate and you'll still end up pretty glycogen depleted by the end because it's just a big session. Other times, if you're doing an easy ride, no, if you consume carbohydrate with that, you wouldn't be depleted by the end. And so again, it's thinking about the type of session. How much is it going to use carbohydrate? How much are you going to end with? And do you actually need to improve your ability to use fat? And sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes the answer is no. And it depends on the individual. It depends on what sort of racing they're trying to do well in and that sort of thing as well.
Alan, with the that glycogen threshold sort of hypothesis, that finishing the sessions with lower amounts of glycogen, is the ability for then the body to, say, improve its ability to use fat as a fuel source, is that diminished if refeeding post-session with carbohydrates occurs?
It's contentious. I don't think we have a clear-cut answer on that yet. There is some suggestion that, you delay feeding with carbohydrate afterwards. Personally, I'm not convinced that the evidence is strong on that yet. I think, we may get to that point, but I don't think we're there yet.
Yeah. And there are some negative consequences around bone and things like that from delaying carbohydrates, where you have to sort of, again, weigh up. I like what you said there about, think about your purpose and what are you trying to achieve in your fueling strategies in session, but also for recovery. And what's more important to you? Is it, could you reduce body fat by being in a caloric deficit, gradually across the day and the week, versus trying to maximize that little bit of fat burning post session, but actually be detrimental potentially to your bone health? And I certainly know which way I would be leaning with athletes, and whether that's male or female. I'd certainly be thinking of bone health, given what we're seeing in the literature with adverse sort of bone mineral density in endurance athletes. And just something to think about, people, when you are trying to, inverted commas, maximize fat burning. Think about the big picture. Okay, next one. If I can change screens. Okay. Manny, your question: how best to integrate creatine monohydrate into your race day fueling plan, or is a pre-race approach better? Look, honestly, creatine monohydrate, it's just 5 grams a day you're taking it. I guess in terms of a pre-race approach, and this could be something to consider, if an athlete has found, which again, one of the biggest negative effects of creatine potentially is increased weight gain, although a lot of that weight gain is associated with preloading, say doing 20 grams a day for the first 5 days. If you did find that you felt you were retaining water as a result of taking creatine, you could effectively come off the creatine a week or 2 weeks before a race and see if that did reduce your body weight, knowing that your creatine stores will still be super compensated from taking the creatine, as long as you've been taking it for at least 4 weeks prior. but you don't have to do anything specific in terms of increasing the amount of creatine or doing anything fancy on race day. Elizabeth or Alan, do you have anything to add to that?
I think
good.
the main thing is that, creatine is something that you build up that store over time. So the
Time.
timing of when you take it doesn't really matter as long as you do take it consistently. And so whether you take it morning, afternoon, before exercise, after exercise, the opposite end of the day to exercise makes no difference. It's about building up that store over weeks rather than trying to get it in the system at a specific time of the day or around exercise.
Yeah. And Manny, I've just written an article that will be published in Training Peaks about creatine monohydrate for endurance athletes, the pros and cons of it. So you can keep your eyes peeled for that one. It's coming out soon. And then Manny, you got a second question. How should I fuel in the 2 weeks before an Ironman 70.3 race? And Alan's going to answer this.
Yeah, I think you've jumped the gun, Manny, because we're actually doing a session all about taper nutrition, I think, coming up later this month. So we'll go into detail about it then. But yeah, I guess the main things there would be considering what's changing with your training in that 2 weeks leading in. And that's generally that you'll probably be doing less volume, but keeping the intensity is, I guess, the stereotypical tapering approach that people would do. So from that perspective, obviously, you still want to be fueling those sessions adequately to get the most out of them. But at the same time, there's probably less of them or there's less duration. And there's possibly more recovery time in between those sessions. And so from that perspective, you're probably not fueling as aggressively as often throughout the week. But I guess the beauty with Fuelin is that it's going to take your training plan and basically sort that out for you in terms of the yellow, greens, and reds. So you shouldn't have to worry too much about that. The app will basically know that from your training schedule. So whatever your training schedule is for your taper, and that might be different. Different coaches have different ways of doing it. The app should adjust your fueling approach for that automatically.
Yeah. The only thing I would add to that, Alan, is maybe for athletes, I think it's really important within the Fuelin app, just check again what your purpose is. Are you still in a body composition / fat loss, which you shouldn't be, obviously, in 2 weeks leading up to the race. You certainly want to adjust your profile, your athlete profile, to make sure you're in performance. And I would secondly just adjust your goal weight to your current weight at that point in time. I don't think, 2 weeks out, I think accept where you're at in terms of body weight, feel good about eating, feel good about fueling, make sure you're not in a caloric deficit. The last thing you want to be is going into a race in a caloric deficit and not fueled appropriately. So just for athletes there, just check, it's a quick check in your athlete profile, check those two things. Again, performance, and update your current body weight to your goal body weight, and you'll be in a good position.
Yeah, and I think a lot of athletes coming off a big training block prior to a taper, they're often, those training blocks are built over the weeks prior to that. And that's often when they're at the greatest risk of suddenly getting sick because they've been pushing that whole time. And so that's the last time you really want to be cutting back excessively, is at that time where you're most vulnerable to getting sick as well.
Yes, I can attest to that.
And
Okay.
I think too, a reminder that their event is actually in the app. I know I've seen a couple athletes lately that have said, why are my meals not green? Because they didn't have it entered correctly. So that's another thing to make sure while you're looking 2 weeks out that your event is scheduled.
Yeah, it's a very good point, actually. And there's a video in the Learn section for athletes to ensure that you do the event correctly. So in Training Peaks and today's plan, you need to, it's a little bit of a funny system, but you need to add in the goals of that event. So you need to add in the duration, and you need to add in the distance of what, that event is, so that it can be picked up correctly. We are working on ways to identify the race better and pick up keywords, but certainly make sure you put in what your estimated duration is going to be, and we'll appropriately fuel that. Okay. Next question. Hello. So what is best to eat prior to a 3+ hour group ride, mostly tempo, for a 60-year-old female, assuming I give myself 2 hours prior to start? If not, what would be my second choice? Also, on the bike, nutrition would be helpful. 5'6", 150 pounds. Thank you for all prior info on YouTube. Elizabeth.
So Sal, I think the easiest answer here is that the app takes care of all of this for you. As long as your training is entered in there, we make it very easy. Anything that is 3 hours plus, you're going to be having a yellow or a green meal ahead of time. Easiest way to do this is make overnight protein oats so that it's ready to go in the morning. If it's a yellow, it's overnight protein oats. If it's a green, you're going to add in some extra fruit, potentially some honey, a slice or two of toast with jam. So really making that base breakfast and then being able to add to that if need be. The recommendation as far as height and weight and gender isn't that significant. We're looking, those components come in over the course of the week. And fueling during that session, again, the app will tell you based on the total duration and intensity of that session. And if there's maybe a run off of that bike after, or if you have harder sessions tomorrow, the app will guide you on how to fuel during that session. But obviously, we've talked about if it's a lower intensity one, there are bars, there are whole food options. If it is a higher intensity option, you can look at gels and chews. Potentially, some athletes like the liquid carbohydrates. So yeah, something to eat based on food preference, how easy it is to carry, what your carbohydrate needs are for that. And also if you want to go on the higher end, if you're trying to work on increasing carbohydrate consumption during those sessions.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, tempo 3-hour group rides. That would be for you. For an athlete, it's going to be higher carb fueling because it's going to be zone 3 or above, I guess, as what would be denoted in the training program. So yeah, it's going to be somewhere between 70 and 100 grams per hour, probably for that athlete, at least as a starting point, just to see where your capacity is. And then based on your actual testing, we would then adjust what your actual grams per hour would be. So whether you put into the lower bucket, the middle, or the upper bucket would be based on what you record, Sal. But yeah, very good. Nice and simple. And obviously, Elizabeth mentioned oats, overnight oats. We obviously love them, but if that's not your preference in the morning, there's certainly other options you could have in the morning first thing. But think about what we've presented on Instagram with that base builder. So have your base, whether that's oats, whether it's a cereal, whether it's toast, whatever, and then just layer on top of that to get your total amount of carbohydrates. It's usually just a quantity factor and just layering on top. Okay, as far as carb and sweat testing is concerned, do you see a big difference between riding on the trainer versus outside? And if so, how can we do more to increase accuracy? This is from Jerry Slaughter, longtime Fuelin athlete. Alan, you want to tackle this one?
Yeah, good question, Jerry. I think there's two parts to this. In terms of the carbohydrate part, I think the differences will be minimal, if at all. So probably don't need to worry too much about that. The big differences are going to come on the sweat testing side of things. Now, generally indoors, sweat test for the equivalent power output or pace or something like that is going to be significantly higher. And that's for a couple of reasons. One will be that the humidity indoors will potentially be higher depending on the size of the space where you're doing that. So if you're in a pretty small confined area, you're sweating, that's going to increase the humidity inside that environment, and that's probably going to increase your sweat rate. But the biggest factor is airflow. Obviously, if you're riding on a bike outdoors, whatever speed you're riding at, you're getting the airflow past your body at that speed, and that's across your entire body from head to toe. Whereas on the trainer, obviously you may or may not have a fan. If you have no fan at all, you'll have a massively high sweat rate because you're just not getting that airflow, which improves the evaporation of sweat off your skin surface. And so as a response, your body will just produce more and more sweat because it's not getting the cooling effect that it wants. Even if you do have a fan in front of you on the trainer, it's still not going to completely simulate the airflow that you get outdoors. Some of the fans, the really fancy ones like the Kickers now have I can't even remember what it's called now, and I've got one in my garage, Kicker Airflow or something. I can't remember the name of it, but it tries to simulate airflow better You can even set it up to adjust the wind speed to the actual moving speed calculated from the trainer. So the faster you go, the more airflow you get to simulate outdoor riding. Even that, I don't think is going to be perfect. I've never actually done a head-to-head test with that, but I suspect it's still not going to completely cover you head to toe with the same airflow that you get outdoors. And so it's not going to be exactly the same. Can we do anything to increase the accuracy? I'm assuming this means if you're doing a sweat test indoors. I think the answer is just trying to simulate the airflow as best you can. And that might mean that if you're using a little fan, I guess a lot of the, just commercial pedestal fans that you'd buy as a normal household appliance are just not going to get to the same kind of airflow and speed that you would get riding outdoors. So if you can afford a fancy kicker fan or something like that, that's probably going to get you more accuracy. Again, it's probably not going to be perfect, but it's going to get you as close as you can. If you're doing a relatively lower pace ride, I suppose, then maybe you set the fan deliberately to be a bit higher than the kind of speed you would anticipate outdoors to try and compensate a bit, but it's never going to be exactly the same. And so I think the moral of the story there with sweat testing is whenever you can, try to do them outdoors, but sometimes just because of where you live and the climate, it's just not possible. I've had athletes recently in Dubai, for example, and it's just been too hot to run or ride outside, or it's just so much hotter than where they're expecting to race. It's not an accurate reflection of sweat rate anyway. And so they've had to do things indoors. Vice versa, you can have, in the Northern American winter, someone's in Canada, for example, you just can't simulate the conditions that you expect outdoors. And I've got someone about to race the Badwater Ultra Marathon in Death Valley, exactly the same thing, living up in Canada. She just can't simulate those conditions outdoors. So I've actually had her indoors in the bathroom, setting up the treadmill in there with a heater to try and simulate those conditions as best we can. But yeah, it's never going to be perfect.
Is there, because the humidity might be increased, indoors, and obviously airflow is reduced, I guess you could have that reverse, like you hinted at, though, isn't there? Like if you're going to be in a high humidity, high temperature race, turn off your fan and do the reverse. I guess would be worth thinking about as well, isn't it?
Or use a humidifier or something like that.
Yeah. It's I think more often than not, I see athletes using fans to get very comfortable, but then they go and race in Florida or something like that, and they wonder why they might blow up. So there certainly is pros and cons of both. Very good.
And I think in terms of accuracy, just a reminder to change the temperature in the app. A lot of times athletes will forget, like they're so interested in entering in what they consumed that they don't pay attention to the temperature. So
no, for sure.
And Scott did a great session around this a couple of weeks ago now. So again, you can go back and have a look at the recording where he actually runs step by step through that process. Yeah.
That's good. Well, that's all the questions for today. Just a reminder, pilot program is only $29 a month. When you buy the annual program, obviously it is $39 a month, and definitely money well worth spending if you have desires to get your performance nutrition in order. It does sync directly with Training Peaks Today's Planned Final Surge and soon to be TriDot. So keep an eye out for that. So I will stop the share. Questions? Manny, did we answer your question?
Almost, but recently you wrote an article in Training Peaks about slow burn carbohydrates. And
I did.
I saw it. I thought it was you.
I did also. We both
did.
Scott and I both did.
I don't think I did, about slow carbohydrates.
Slow burn carbohydrates, yeah.
I don't think I did. Maybe I did. Maybe a long time ago. Elizabeth,
maybe
did you write
it was
one?
the gel article.
Potentially.
I wrote one about. I wrote one about gels, Manny. Is that what you're referring to?
I'm not sure, but the question I had is that I had a different nutritionist in the past, in the rearview mirror, who was suggesting I use a combination of slow burn, like the UCAN product, in addition to some other stuff like the Vitargo or some other gel. So I was just trying to understand the difference of opinion between the different carbs that one could be using.
I'll have a go first, and then feel free, you can all jump in. I mean, the point of carbohydrates is deliver energy fairly quickly. So I think unless you're going to be very deprived of carbohydrates and fuel, i.e. maybe a ultra endurance event where maybe you're not going to get any access to food, then maybe these slow carbohydrates could be worthwhile. I think the evidence for them, it's not robust enough. I think you've seen also research showing that athletes consuming them, certainly in decent amounts, will have an increased risk of GI complaints, because they can have delayed gastric emptying, but also increased gastric emptying as well. Is that right, Alan? They can have both.
Yeah, potentially.
As a result of them. Yeah. And look, I think again, you got to go back to what Alan was saying about purpose. Like, what are you taking things for? And if you're taking carbohydrates because you're working at a certain intensity. That intensity is going to be roughly 65% of your VO2 max, maybe 75% of your max heart rate. You're working at an intensity whereby your body is going to preferentially use carbohydrates. Why do you want to slow down the delivery of that? That would be my argument. Once you go over a certain duration, you're tapping into your fat stores anyway, and you've got then not an endless supply, but you've got a fairly significant supply of fat at that point in time too. So I think it's, if you really want to maximize your fat burning ability, go to what Alan was saying, like you can reduce carbohydrates maybe during the session. You don't have to deplete them. You don't have to completely, reduce them. You can still take them on, but as long as you finish those sessions at a lower glycogen state, then your body is going to, improve its ability to use fat as a fuel source as well. So yeah, that's pretty much where I sit with these slow carbs, I think, is, as you might call them. And Vitago is one. Palatinos, Vitago. What else? I think UCAN uses Palatinos, doesn't it? So that's my take on them. Alan, Elizabeth, anything?
Yeah, I think it's pretty similar to the, Elizabeth's comments around MCT oil, and I think it falls into a kind of a similar category here. It's been promoted, I guess, by people that are talking about trying to increase the amount of fat that people are using during exercise. But my argument would be, well, if you're trying to increase the use of fat during exercise, you either feed carbohydrate or you don't feed carbohydrate, rather than this in between of trying to feed carbohydrate but trick the body into thinking you're not feeding. Like, it just doesn't make sense to me personally. These sort of products, personally, I've used them once in my 20-year career, and that was with someone with type 1 diabetes to help them with their carb loading, so they didn't get the big increase in blood sugar. And it was just around dealing with their particular type of insulin that they were taking, that they needed that kind of sustained response. But outside of that, personally, I haven't really seen a need for it. I mean, I've had some athletes that have chosen to go keto. It wasn't necessarily because I'd convinced them that they should, but that was just what they wanted to do, and I supported them to do that, and they were able to do that just fine without this kind of a product as well. But then, particularly for elite athletes or shorter, very high intensity environments or events, why would you want to slow down the delivery of carbohydrate to the muscle? That just makes no sense. And certainly if you look across, world tour cycling, elite marathon running, any of those events that are done at a fairly high intensity at the highest level, these products just don't exist in that world because it would be detrimental to performance. Yeah.
I second and third that point. I think a point I always make a couple, and is that, we all saw the Nike's 4-hour project. Like, no one was fueling with UCAN. They were using Morton gels. Like, the super starches was not the fuel on course for a very specific reason. And Manny, I don't think that this is why you're asking this question, but I've had so many athletes ask that I'm going to touch on it. A lot of times this question comes because athletes, they're looking to lose weight and they're using exercise as part of a weight loss component. And so in their mind, they're thinking, oh, if I can still exercise and get the fuel that I need, then it will help me to lose weight. And that's where I really want to separate like, if you love triathlon and you want to participate in triathlon, that's great. You can utilize it for performance, or you can use it as a form of exercise to get healthy. But it is, we really have to separate the idea of like training and earning your food and, the calorie consumption and fat burning foods and low sugar foods. And it's like, you fuel for the work required that you're doing. And if weight loss and body composition is a focus and is important, you do that outside of training.
Yeah, absolutely. Does that answer your question, Manny?
Yeah, pretty much. For me, touching on Elizabeth's point, yeah, my goal is to successfully finish an 8-hour, 29-minute window of exercise.
There you go. And have fun doing it. And
if I lose a little weight along the way, okay, I'll take it.
There you go. That's a good attitude. I like it.
You'll manage that, Manny. Amy, I know you had a question that we didn't get to answer today that you did submit. Do you, if you want, do you want to ask that question? And you'll have to unmute and turn on your camera.
If I can get it on. Hi.
Hi.
I think my cat is here.
Yeah.
My question was about nausea in a race and whether you feel that's more related to hydration or nutrition or heat. And I think my question was more, what do you recommend if people encounter that from a fueling perspective on the run of an Ironman?
Yeah, I think, look, there's so many parts to this, Amy, where to your point, that is the point, is that it is a point or a case of deduction. So you've got to go through and work systematically through, what products are you consuming first and foremost? Like, what are the ingredients within those? And I touched on this in that article in the gels, what to look for. Are you taking whole food type gels in? And is that causing the problem? Are you taking in too much glucose per hour and oversaturating the ability to absorb it? Are you taking in too much fructose relative to your total carbohydrate consumption? Is the palatability of those, the texture, the sweetness, is that something that's impacting you? What is your sweat rate? Do you understand how much fluid you require? Are you taking in too much fluid for the amount of fluid you're losing, or are you under consuming the fluid for the amount of fluid you're losing? Have you been practicing the ability to take on the amount of fluid required at the given intensity and the given temperature in the appropriate type of exercise? So, i.e. on the bike, and also doing that in the run. Are you practicing the brick? Are you practicing consuming the required amount of carbohydrate and the amount of fluid on the bike, and then doing 40 to 60 minute run off the bike, and then practicing the nutrition, hydration, and the actual carbohydrate required for that intensity? And I think if you go through all of those points and go, actually, no, I'm not doing any of that, or I'm doing absolutely everything of that, it will start to give you sort of some clarity as to where you might be going wrong.
Got it. I think the answer to the question was yes to almost every one of those, but it sounds like a complicated answer.
As in you're doing all of them?
Yeah, it's doing the vast majority of those, and still, vomiting on the run. So probably more heat related, but I'm working with it. So, and
heat obviously, and Alan, I know you'll jump in, but heat will obviously impact gastric emptying. It can increase that discomfort. The ability to consume fluids can be reduced. The ability to consume carbohydrates can be reduced due to heat. I guess the question, like back to what Alan was saying, is, are you simulating that as well? Are you practicing consuming fluids and carbohydrates in a similar environment to what you're going to be tackling in a race?
Yeah, minus the heat, which you can't always control, right? When you go from one environment to the next, it's hard, to control that necessarily. But yeah,
but try the heat acclimation stuff. So either turning up your thermostat in the bathroom, like Alan said, moving your bike in there or in your room, wearing extra clothes, wearing beanies, wearing jumpers, things like that. So you're actually making yourself be uncomfortable with it. And then passive heat acclimation. So are you doing hot water immersion or sauna?
Yeah, I read about that. Yeah.
11 to 14 days prior. And certainly we've got a protocol that we can share with you related to that. So sorry, I keep jumping in. Alan, go.
I was going to say, yeah, I mean, I've actually just created, I can put it up if you want, just this little poster that describes all of this, just to show you the complexity of it. But I guess that the fact is that there's all these different factors that are going on simultaneously. I'll share it actually. And the point here is that people get hung up on what is the one thing that's causing my problem. The problem is, as you can see here, there's potentially a lot of things causing the problem, and there's so many things going on potentially simultaneously as well. And so what generally happens is people go, okay, well, I'm going to be scientific about this and change one thing at a time to try and find the cause of the problem. But because there usually isn't a cause or the cause of the problem, you change one thing at a time and you never find out what's going on. So rather than changing one thing at a time, you actually have to take an approach of trying to change everything or as many of the things that you can control at the same time. And that's what you do here. And so it's thinking about small frequent carbohydrate during exercise, thinking about what you're doing in the days before exercise, the gut training that Scott talked about before, the hydration that Scott talked about before, the heat acclimation that we just mentioned. Anxiety on race day can have a component to that as well, which is fundamentally different to training, which is why often people say this all happens on race day, but I can never replicate it in training. The use of medications, ibuprofen, those non-steroidal anti-inflammatories can have an effect as well. And even stimulants, either as medications or as caffeine, can have an impact as well. So I guess the point here is that, don't just change one thing at a time to try and find what the cause is, because you'll be searching forever and never find it. You've got to control as many different things as you can to try and reduce basically the body's stress response to exercise, the body temperature, optimize the hydration, and do that gut training as well, as Scott mentioned.
And I guess when you are changing all those factors, make sure you're documenting it to understand. So you're being systematic in your approach to it. So if you are going to change things, be aware of what you're changing and actually note that for the session. And so you still may get some issues, but then you can go back and look at what you changed and then maybe tweak again that. Maybe it wasn't exactly what was required, and you can tweak again and again and again until you get those results. And it works. Like, I can speak from practical experience working with many athletes, female and male, who have had issues with their gut. And it's often a case of just going through the process and being systematic about it, but not one-offs as well. I think the point being is like, like we talked about in the sweat testing, a one-off sweat test is going to do very little to give you indication of, what's actually happening. You need to do multiple ones on the bike, on the run, differing temperatures at those intensities, and build that bank of data so that you can actually deduct what it is actually happening. Same with carb. You might do a one-off carb test and take in 50 grams of carbs. That's not to say you can only take in 50 grams of carbs. You may get some GI complaint with that time. You repeat that with exactly the same amount, and then next time you don't get any issues. So it's just repetition. You're on the bike, you're running heaps anyway. Like, use all the training sessions you're doing to sort of, become sort of the N=1. Be your own scientist in what works. And you generally will get to the point. But certainly, in terms of guidance, Amy, I know you're a doctor. But don't be afraid of, I think it's one of those things, like, lean on people who maybe can help as well. So, Alan's got, Alan, Elizabeth, and myself have a lot of experience in working with athletes with these issues. So if you've had it for long enough and it's derailing your race, I would say,
major derail.
I always think, like, athletes spend so much time training and doing that, and then they have a bad race and they're like, shit. And it maybe was avoidable just by actually leaning on someone with that experience. And it's no different from coaching. Me trying to coach myself or any of us trying to coach ourselves. I mean, I'm sure there are athletes out there who can do it, but I would rather lean on a coach who has an experience in triathlete coaching to get me through it rather than trying to bumble my way through it. So, and I'm not
Sure.
saying you're bumbling your way through it. I'm saying
Yeah.
maybe the experience could be a lot better if you just, something like what Alan just shared, and we'll look to, reshare that. But something like that is like, okay, wow, that is really being systematic about the approach, and maybe I can do this approach a little bit better with a little bit of guidance. But yeah, so feel free to reach out. You can just send an email if you want, Amy, or you've got our email. You can reach out to Coach at Fuelin.
Thank you. I like the charts. Those are great.
Yeah, they are.
Great, Alan.
Very good. Well, look, I know we're about up on time, so if no one has any further questions, then we will say goodbye, and until another month, we will answer more questions. I know we had a lot of questions to answer this month, and we were fairly selective in what we were answering. So next month we'll get to those ones. Okay, thanks everyone.
Ciao.
Yeah.
Chat to you soon.
See ya.
Thank you. Bye bye.